Okay, mouse got loose, as they say. I'm not, I know. Oh, well, was I muted? I don't know. I wasn't saying anything. Anyway, let me set this up a little further. I also went to the bathroom in my little, I should have stopped the recording. But anyway, so I let you in on a little secret. Regardless, anyway, there's a variety of things I wanted to look at. And give me a couple more seconds here. So I began, or I had planned originally to look at Rockhill's work, Gabriel Rockhill's work, and then I added Steve Keen's work to what I was doing. And in both cases, it is, on the one hand, it is Rockhill's work is an attack on certain heterodox, you could call them, Western Marxism, as opposed to a more orthodox Marxism, a purely class struggle based anti-imperialist Leninist Marxism. And it may be simply scapegoating Western Marxism, which is certainly possible to do because in looking at the history of post-war Marxism since World War II, there's um, a system of divergences that comes with uh, the development of post-war cultures, expansion of universities, the recovery of a whole variety of things that come with the post-war period. And so, there's improvements in capitalism. It's, for some people, the golden age, whatever they want, however you want to call it. And so you get expansion of everything. That is the a military industrial complex, but also you have, universities, education, the demographics, so many people got killed during World War II. And then you have this sort of the reconfiguring of cultures, not only in terms of refugees, migration, um, but simple reproduction, right? How many people just got killed in Russia, for example? I mean, they bore the largest proportion of people who perished um, during World War II, and in many ways, they deserve to be acknowledged as the reason why Nazism gets defeated. So that's one element, and it explains a lot of dominance and stuff like that. So I've already done a tape that covered all of Rockhill, and I think with respect, he plays a little fast and loose with his critique of the left, and and it appears conservative in that sense because you could actually use his arguments to say, well, all this DEI stuff should disappear because it's just a manifestation of this sort of bad Marxism or bourgeois, professional managerial class, petty bourgeois, whatever. And yes, that's a legitimate critique, uh, especially if you sort of lived through how, the knowledge base began to move into these more intersubjective areas. Now, part of that is simply because you had demographic expansion. It's just unfortunate. I mean, the same things that you would talk about in terms of the rise of post-war Marxism or Western Marxism as opposed to an orthodox Marxism that is driven more by the Soviet Union, the Comintern, blah, 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 all of that stuff. You could say, yes, it is probably petty bourgeois activity. It's expansion, demographic expansion. I mean, you just get more, and I don't want to have to go through all the details, but I would assume that you have increases in graduate programs for various things, whether it's sociology, cultural studies. I mean, actually, I've seen departments like that where essentially, and there's just too many sociologists out there at some moment. But people went into sociology because it had that relevance, right? It was the counterculture, social change, the welfare state, all of those things are there. So you get that kind of natural expansion of that sort of stuff. And but what comes with it, of course, is that you have the surveillance state, Cold War, all that other stuff going on at the same time. They just are there simultaneously. So you want to sort of have to deal with that, and I think that's what Rockhill is looking at. And what he wants to do is to defend it, or to clearly circumscribe the difference between a kind of Western Marxist, whatever the hell that is. It's more Anglo-American in many ways, although I think you could argue that in and structuralism and post-structuralism in a variety of fields in the post-war period, that kind of lent itself to that sort of interpretation too. So in literary criticism, all of that other stuff, you have that going on in sort of opposition to. And yes, there are people who just simply do whatever they're doing, whether it's you're in an English department or a French department or some other humanities department. There are people who actually are wedded to a dialectical historical materialism. And I've even met some of and if you were doing a social history of this kind of activity in the humanities, you could actually see this. The problem, of course, is that it's not uniformly distributed, and problematized for all kinds of other reasons. Access to being able to be published. There's a sort of the indulgence of sort of quote unquote avant-garde, PMC activity. And it's wonderful. I mean, you can invest in it, you actually get research money, and those kinds of things develop. And so, but you can't reduce it to that. That is that if you apply social history to uh, to literature or to theater, for example, I just picked up or found a book that is a 2024 book on theater, on and how capital is a kind of way of talking about the underlying analysis, which is not new. I mean, people have been doing this for decades, of more material analysis of cultural production. I mean, to give it the large picture of it, theater, the arts are part of cultural production, and you can apply a materialist analysis, and it bifurcates, of course. If you think of Western Marxists as revisionists who attempt to transform some of the fundamental tenets of dialectical and historical materialism, DHM. The problem, of course, is if you're too much into DHM, into this particular position, it tends to place culture or cultural production as sort of a handmaiden, or sort of an auxiliary to the necessary path of Marxism towards revolution, et cetera, et cetera. So there's automatically an intellectual division of labor that presumes that people who do stuff in these other areas, and yes, we could even divide them up in a variety of ways, and you can go back to Marx to talk about that in terms of paid and unpaid labor, as if, and yes, Marx even talks about that, about the difference between cultural labor and real labor, whatever in quotes. You can see that that's a problem. So they generally reject Marxist materialist ontology and the dialectics of nature, and that's already a problematic generalization. And they focus on cultural criticism at the expense of political economy. Now, Rockhill's point in setting this up in this way is, of course, his critique of Frankfurt School Marxism or cultural studies, or however you want to frame it. And unfortunately, you could use Rockhill if you were a right-wing nut and use this to sort of bash all kinds of stuff if you misread, Rockhill. But fortunately, we can read Rockhill in the original and with a clear focus on what he's actually saying, as opposed to all these nuts out there, propagandists, crazy people, uh, conspiracy theorists, whatever. There's all that. We'll just forget about that for the moment. And as I've tried to say, there's this somewhat relatively simple, break between the two activities that does not represent the actual power relations. In other words, there are all these people who are, in a Western Marxist tradition who are out there. Not enough of them, of course, are organized in ways that would be actually useful to create, there are very few universities, for example, that actually have, a fully left-wing political economy department, or even I mean, even cultural departments of one kind or another, English literature or whatever, they don't have the kind of strength, as I was pointing out in my last little video thing. They don't have the same kind of strength in the American context that the British do, where you can actually find many people of different stripes, but of similar material and dialectical and historical materialist, sort of understanding. But for the most part, and I don't mean to overgeneralize, but I don't think you can find a department of any kind that is a non-science, non-engineering, non-business a department that, in an academic sense, that would have many Marxists or many left-oriented people. And of course, at some moment, it bifurcates, right, or it divides, because there are some people who are, sort of advanced in terms of applying certain types of cultural analysis to get tenure or to do whatever, and they're there, but you don't see very many of them. So that's kind of the point he's making, that Rockhill is making. And so, you know, Rockhill's point, of course, is that it's an attack on theory, that they're just doing theory, that and that it's determinative in terms of getting a revolution going or some other thing. Um, And so, the bourgeois idea that only art, culture, theory can save us, not revolutionary class struggle, one of the leitmotifs of the discourse. The overinflation of the superstructural, that is the difference between base and superstructure, this, and that's an arbitrary distinction in terms of base superstructure, because that only represents a certain portion of, sort of Marxist thought. And it is a kind of, it's a loose generalization that doesn't have great explanatory power, but it's there and we have to sort of use it. But I think we can't sort of say, oh, okay, well, that's just superstructural and that's just the base. That's just not the way to do it. But unfortunately, much of the discourse defaults to that. It says, well, you know, all this superstructural stuff is epiphenomenal or other kinds, or they imply that it is less relevant. It's like comparing industrial capital versus financial capital. And the reality, of course, and I would assert that this is the case, and we know this for the last couple of decades, is that financial capital really does run the whole deal, and that making asking certain questions about industrial capital and ultimately questions about labor, et cetera, are problematic, because there's all this other interference that every person who has to live a middle class or a working class life is confronted with a ponderous amount of superstructural things that get in the way of life. And That's intentional. It's purposeful in the sense of trying to actually achieve a sustainable life. And often people just simply get defined by their leisure activities or their preferences or other things, and that can lapse into other terrible stuff. So anyway, this overinflation of the superstructural expresses a self-aggrandizing assessment of the role of professional intellectuals like themselves, and reflects their petty bourgeois class standing, as though we all have little uniforms that say, whether we're bourgeois, petty bourgeois, uh, avant-garde, arrière-garde, the proletariat. I don't think very many people actually just simply say, I'm a proletarian, and that's just that. And uh, it's not a way in which we, sort of frame our own identities or whatever. And that's in some ways a result of this same, petty bourgeois, intellectualism, PMC, blah, blah, blah. And, people who think that because they're in academia, that they're not proletarians is, incredibly problematic and stupid. But, a significant number of people believe that, even though they still engage in wage labor, they still worry about, really petty things that are part of clearly bourgeois culture, and want to achieve, and ultimately at higher levels, of course, certain kind of weird standing. And you see the overlap in terms of punditry in the more recent case, and because of media, and because of, you can do a whole media analysis thing, and that some people, only a very few, unfortunately, they can be divided according to their class identities or class standing or class origins. And that's always an issue. I mean, it just is an issue. You can see that people with proletarian backgrounds who become college professors are actually kind of, they're really interesting people, because they do maintain, in certain cases, they maintain the kind of need to understand origins. They deal with working class literature. They deal with um, well, Marxism. I mean, there are certain people who just do that because it's part of, how they've grown up. And if you've grown up in a more proletarianized kind of cultural situation, you tend in those directions. On the other hand, you can, of course, be aspiring, achieving, you know, just because you get to rub elbows with the ruling class doesn't mean you can join the club. And that's very clear if you've grown up in where you can see the differences. People who can't see the differences, of course, wind up being people like Trump, just clueless about relationship to, working class stuff. On the other hand, you can pretend that you're part of it by uh, being more vulgar and profane and stupid, and that may create some sort of identity. And in some cases, as in Trumpism, he can maintain support only because certain ideological positions that are reactionary and class driven are part of the whole Trumpist mystique. And is part of the false consciousness of it. In other words, you have people driving their big, expensive pickup trucks, and they think they're proletarians. They may be from an economic class point of view, but from an ideological perspective, they're just as PMC as anybody else relative to uh, either actions as a waged earning profession or a variety of other things. So that's all there. It is all there. You have labor aristocracy. You have all the kinds of things that are applied in the 19th century apply now. There's labor aristocracy, and Rockhill talks about this. There's labor aristocracy in academia. And he kind of resists that, but he has the advantage of, because he's two PhDs, but he has a French graduate education, which allows him to have that kind of, you can have that sort of luxury. I mean, and if you want to look at his position, because of the people he studied with and blah, 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 he's kind of positioned in a decent place. He has a decent, it's a non-Ivy university, but he's in a proper place with tenure, et cetera, and so he's properly positioned within the PMC. And I think he tries to this kind of activity tries to sort of as it were disavow or critique the whole business. I mean, he has a proletarian origin, so this is not anything, or more proletarian origin. So this is not anything new, and he's perfectly happy to talk about that. Uh, but it is, the a classic example in one sense. You sort of, uh, uh, like most of us, we kind of overshoot, or we we run out of peer, or our aspirations are, our eyes are, are more powerful than our stomachs, or whatever. Um, anyway, so this is what he's essentially looking at. And so, thus they can give a form a new or idea or messianic opening of the heavens on the one hand, or on the other, in a more terrestrial form, a popular movement or jacquerie that rejects the status quo. However, they eschew the disciplined forms of hierarchical organization and strategic planning identified with communism. And that's just an over, I think that that well, at some moment, people aren't even, I don't think they should call themselves leftists in that context. But anyway, this helps guarantee that their defeatist convictions will be confirmed. They'll never be able to change the world if you think this only requires a newfangled theory. And this is kind of a misreading of what counts as the avant garde. And I would assert that his book on art does that. I mean, it's certainly interesting. And I see the difference between art and politics, and that it's always problematized, and that it's unfortunate that artists don't have that kind of political commitment. I mean, some of them do, of course, and that's why you have an avant-garde within the context, and particularly in terms of the use of the term within the context of modernity, that you have that there. I mean, it's just really important. Russian constructivism and et cetera, the Bauhaus. There's politics is still always there, and the commitments are there as well. But ultimately, when you look at the histories, that is, for example, um, as an intellectual history, the members of the Bauhaus, while they had political commitments, didn't have the same kind of political commitments that the Frankfurt School had. And while that's whether that's good or bad is a whole different question. But that story still needs to be written, and maybe Rockwell's going to write it. On the other hand, I find that his discussion of the use of these ideas within the context of post-war period, and particularly the Frankfurt School, while fine, and I think it serves an articulating purpose, I don't see that it gets us anywhere, other than the fact that, yes, we know that the federal government in the United States does have a cultural policy, and its cultural policy is often manifest in the actions of its intelligence services. And that's just no different than MI5 or MI6. It's the same kind of business that is often reflected on in James Bond films. The issue of some people who actually have more position, or more ruling class, make that comment about Bond. That Bond is not completely. He's an orphan. He has, you know, uh, even though he went to Cambridge or Oxford or whatever, it's the comment that's made in Casino Royale about that. That he, he has a ruling class education, but he never really is comfortable with it. That's to sort of paraphrase, because he's this little banter with Vesper, and the female, whatever, heroine of the piece, and has, there's tragedy there, et cetera, et cetera. But it does have those kinds of elements, the questions of being orphaned, which does come up again, at least in the you know this later sort of transformation of the arc of the James Bond thing, which is going to shift, or they've made these attempts to shift it, right? A female Bond, or a black female Bond, which makes it all kinds of crazy. So at least for some people, because in fact, the intelligence services are, largely, they represent male privilege. They represent, class interests, and that's in the case in both American and British intelligence services, and probably trickles down into other intelligence services. So that's the point of Rockhill. Rockhill is looking at all this trove of materials, the files that the feds keep on suspicious individuals. The people, they born in Europe, they came here. Some of them are communists, or whatever, and you can see all of that, and it's really wonderful to see that kind of exposition. That's what Rockhill spent a fair amount of time. That's why he does this 3-volume thing. And shows, oh well, the curtain is pulled back, and blah blah blah, and that's fine. It just doesn't get you anywhere. Ultimately, it still doesn't get you anywhere, because it won't change the nature of how we think of the Vietnam War. It doesn't change the nature of the Cold War. It won't give us any kind of reasonable model of critique to just simply say, well, they were keeping an eye on Marcuse and blah 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 blah. It's much more. The intellectual history of it is deeper than that and more complicated, and maybe Rockhill's going to do that. And I hope that he does. But at the front end, he's got all this material, and it's really good material. I just think that it needs to go a little further, and I haven't seen that. But then again, I've only looked at volume 1, and volume 2 and 3 may change that opinion. So anyway, so it is the failure of having a kind of revolt, and that often other more radical forms are important to think about. These whatever, the PMCs, I guess we could even refer them that as that, often fall back on simplistic moralizing approaches that naively advocate for horizontalist democracy and criticize all forms of domination, rather than thinking in politically strategic terms about how to structurally modify society over the long term in order to make democracy truly universal and substantive. And I just think that I don't even think that these people are, worth thinking about. If they do think anyone who would actually think this way, it's not a very good, sort of Marxist. I mean, it's just that they're, they've they've pursued a kind of uh, uh, a moment that looks at Western Marxism in order to fulfill their careers, or and that's even a dead end. And ultimately, they just care about individualized, personal leisure time bourgeois practices. So I just I don't think that you can just tarnish or paint all these people. They thus tend not to be strategic thinkers who recognize that the dialectics of socialism sometimes requires tactics that might appear to contradict the overall goal, but are the only way of advancing socialism in the real world. I think everyone has confronted that, and of course, you make your decision. Are you going to play along, or are you going to actually do something, resist? Finally, if given the choice between communism and capitalism, Western Marxists practically side with the latter over and against the former. So, they're just traitors. There's betrayal everywhere. I just don't think it's as easy as that. And if you know something about the history of communism, particularly the Communist Party or communism in the United States, you can see that it's always been the same people from whom, or would create these files that Rockhill loves, to use as empirical data. Is they're the ones who are also infiltrating, things like the Communist Party. The Communist Party, it probably has never grown in the United States because it had too many informers in it, had too many plants from various intelligence agencies, and if lest you think that's unimportant, the for example, the Red Squad in the LA police is actually a pretty significant organization, and caused all kinds of trouble for people who just have had even minor leftist tendencies in the 50s and 60s. But anyway, Western Marxists practically side with the latter over against the former, but despite their criticisms of capitalism, some of which are well-founded, they tend to be anti-communist, capitalist accommodationists. God, um, I put it on a T-shirt. Uh, I I do think that there are accommodationists. I just wouldn't go all the way and saying, I don't think they're specifically anti-communist. I just think that they're not very smart, or they haven't done enough reading, or they need a little more critique. And so I'm a reformist in that. You could call me a reformist in that I think people can be reformed in that context. Whereas Rockhill would just say, well, they're just not worth dealing with. I think he's probably more generous than that. And in fact, when you see his when he speaks in public and stuff, it seems more, you know, uh, friendly, I guess. And for example, we got here because I mean, I've was had looked at Rockhill before, but our friend Adnan decided to interview Rockhill, so you got to have a little sense in one of the previous Adnan podcasts that how certain things are important, and of course, I don't think he ever said any communist capital is accommodationist, even if he thought it. So the overall effect of Western Marxism's global promotion, petty bourgeois cultural commodity with little use value for practical struggles over and against the collective and innovative science of liberation known as DHM, dialectical historical materialism. Since the latter has proven its ability to practically transform the world by breaking the chains of imperialism, clearly from the vantage point of the ruling class, the most dangerous theoretical weapon of class struggle. There's no, refuting that. Because it's not been able to eradicate it outright, the bourgeoisie has worked with elements of the bourgeois state and the bourgeois cultural apparatus, which, has nurtured all of us, unfortunately, to cultivate a commodified version of Marxism that can spread the virus of anti-communism under the cover of a red-colored pill. Now, that may be a generational difference, I mean, relative to the Matrix, et cetera, but in fact, I don't think you can divide it up that easily. And, I think even just looking from someone's limited perspective on the interweb or whatever is, I think that it's not quite as virulent, this anti-communism, although I do think that we are at a very problematic stage where there are, communist pretenders, faux communists out there that make it even more difficult for people to make sort of a critical choice. So this is it produced an imperious industry of ineffective academic discourses that are promoted around the globe as the vanguard of Marxist. God, I don't see that. I mean, I guess, he tries to prove that it exists. I do not see it quite that way. I don't see it as an imperious industry of ineffective academic discourse. I see the academic discourses. I see that often the characters involved in it are imperious, depending on their career, the point in their career timelines. But I don't think it's quite as, practically speaking, serve to misdirect, confuse, or merely alienate those in search of a rigorous theoretical guide to understanding and transforming the world. I think if you assume, I mean, that's already self-limiting. I think that, a good education will allow you to gain, and it doesn't matter where you're coming from relative to class position or other kinds of resources, whatever, that a rigorous theoretical guide to understanding and transforming the world is still possible. And that those who weigh in or who serve reformist positions on this, they're just traitors or whatever. That's fine. I just don't think that you can call. I don't think even think they deserve to be called Marxists or whatever. Anyway, so much for my complaining about Rockhill and the fact that I think that he oversimplifies the divisions of these things. I mean, it's easier to write when you make these generalizations, but I don't think it's quite as easy as he claims it is. And of course, he has the advantage of coming from a European a kind of perspective on this, where these things are kind of easier to identify. Certainly within the context of British or UK or English speaking Anglophone activity, you can sort of see where these things work out or don't work out. And you can say that, America is just sort of a lost cause for many people. Now, he can afford to say that in both ways, considering that he's able to do stuff in Europe and have tenure in the United States. And, it's nice if you can get the gig. And there are a lot of people who do that and who are, actually, card carryingable Marxists. The primary purpose of understanding an extensive dialectic critique of Western or cultural Marxism, thereby demonstrating is ultimately imperial Marxism. You see, this move towards that there is an imperial Marxism out there, I just think it's canard. I guess it could be there, but it's not. An imperial Marxism is not exactly the same as imperial Trumpism, for example. I just don't think it has that viability. But I see that it has, of course, in certain places dominated. I think you can argue that one does exist, whether it's, whether framing it that way is useful. I'm not sure. Has been to provide people the knowledge necessary for them to orient themselves in the intellectual world war, figure out what side they're on. The problem is that it's not two sides. This is really a multiplicity of sides. And yes, that sounds like the post-structural, post-Marxist, or, whatever, postmodern kind of perspective. But the fact is, there's no two sides. There are just a lot of sides. It's a multipolar world, and one needs to get used to that. It's not as simple. The dialectic itself is not that simple. So anyway, and advance in the most coherent direction. Well, I think that there are multiple directions, and I think if you read Mao properly, that there's not one direction. There's, a lot of stuff. And getting there takes a while and much longer than you expect. Since there's been more of a subtext throughout the analysis, let us conclude then by indicating that direction, by briefly outlining the principal features of an anti-imperialist Marxism. So let me conclude, my little yammering here because I'm going to run out of time anyway, is the section on anti-imperialist Marxism. At least begin that and then explain that, that's the reason why I got to the Steve Keen article, because Steve Keen, he never goes out and says he's a Marxist. I mean, he does Marxist stuff and he does bourgeois stuff too. So, it's fine. You shouldn't, trash him for that. I mean, he does what you need to do if you're going to survive in academia. You call yourself a post-Keynesian so you can engage in more dialectical and historical materialism without being shoved into a particular position for a variety, just being discriminated against, or labeled, that just makes people crazy. So I would say, and when you read the Keen article, you'll see that he's being even-handed about it. He's raising the kind of questions that are necessary, that are, he identifies the kind of dogmatic kind of positions that might create a imperial Marxism, but in fact, on the other side, make a dogmatic version of dialectical DHM, dialectical historical materialism, because it is those people as well who are part of the problem. And I think when you look at Losurdo or those other kind of people who kind of resist, this Western Marxism stuff in a variety of ways, it doesn't make you a Stalinist. It just makes you go, well, that's kind of how Stalinism was constructed, and it's not a good thing, but you can understand the structure of it without just sort of simply, denying it outright, because it is part of the larger DHM issue, is that you have to sort of take the bad with the good, socialism in one country, a whole bunch of other things. Anti-imperialist Marxism has not been promoted by the imperial theory industry. Now, I would assert that, yes, I would agree that there is an imperial theory industry, but I don't necessarily think of it as a, I just don't see Marxism as being an important part of it. I think that the imperial theory industry is something that's more defined by whether you own a Mercedes or not than anything else, or a Beamer. But anyway, that's just me, which has instead demoted and often demonized it, or at least repackaged it to try and make it look like something different. It's oriented first and foremost towards changing the world instead of merely interpreting it. Of course, that's, that is the inverse of the Marxian thing about, we've got to change the world. But anyway, in this regard, it maintains that what Lenin refers to as the revolutionary core of Marxism, which revisionists of various stripes have tried to gut. And yes, that is true. There is a revolutionary core. It is built on certain, problematic elements that, as Steve Keen will point out, are problematic elements that result from a certain point of view on political economy and, and on Marx. But it doesn't make you any less a Marxist when you sort of identify that, oh, okay, this is just the classical political economy side of Marx that, some people have either overdetermined or qualified. But anyway, in this sense, anti-material Marxism is Marxism to core, or Marxism in the area of imperialism that is unaltered by those who have tried to eliminate its essence. Now, as a philosopher, he really, anyway, I think that's kind of a problematic statement even. But anyway, it might also be said more generally that whereas Western Marxism is a particular cultural permutation or perversion, which would best be described as imperial Marxism, indicating both its source and its ideological orientation, the Marxism dedicated to anti-colonial and anti-imperialist emancipation is universal Marxism. DHM of this sort developed in opposition to the capitalist class and bourgeois states through popular struggles and the fight from below. Now, rhetorically, that's exactly how you're supposed to talk. But on the other hand, demonizing other people for not being, enough, DHM enough, is going to be a fruitless activity. As Lenin insightfully argued, drawing on Marx, revolutionary politics requires that segments of the bourgeois intelligentsia commit class suicide and ally with the working class, thereby contributing developed forms of scientific analysis that require training and expertise beyond what the working class is generally given under access to under capitalism. Well, that's the kind of misreading of it. And, I just don't think that class, it's worth talking about what counts as class suicide. You give up tenure, you go, work in community colleges, even though you don't have to, and stuff like that. I suppose that's kind of the path he's thinking about, but he doesn't, he doesn't even have that path. And it's unclear to me whether, that's supposed to be the optimal thing. Anyway, however, the class basis of DHM is in the working and oppressed peoples of the world, and particularly those that have been the most exploited in the colonial periphery, not the intellectual labor aristocracy a la imperial Marxism. Now, I would assert that Rockhill does not fully appreciate the fact that center periphery arguments are themselves problematic, because in under settler colonialism and post-colonial or neo-colonial structures, you already get a kind of intellectual labor aristocracy. That's why there exists, really important and interesting approaches to Marxism from people in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, etc. All of those things are there, and they are really important because, and it depends on how they're able to communicate that or interact with kind of the world system Marxism. DHM is firmly grounded in the primacy of practice. Yes, it is an evolving collective tradition of analyzing and intervening in the world, and it is therefore of necessity a practical process of learning. This is what Paulo Freire talks about. This is how one has to proceed or should proceed, and it's very difficult to do that. If you teach part-time and you're teaching a fixed curriculum, it's really hard to sort of reorganize learning itself in a more collective tradition. And sometimes you win and most times you lose. Rather than exchange value is use value. Now, this division of exchange value, use value is the same one that Keene is talking about. And the problem for Rockhill, or the problem that Keene would find with Rockhill, is the kind of simple division of this idea, because value is constructed in a certain way. And I assume that Rockhill has other works that work through this problem, but in this particular piece, it seems a little oversimplified and dichotomous in a not a false dichotomous way, or tends to false dichotomy. Anyway, that guides it insofar as it tries to provide the most rigorous, coherent, and systematic understanding of concrete reality and how to change it. What is often fetishized in imperial Marxism is theoretical innovation for its own sake, and practical Marxism is commonly denigrated for being, yes, reductivist, dogmatic, orthodox, and so forth. But I think that, with all due respect, and in terms of being from a Western Marxist point of view, you could say that all people who are reductivist, dogmatic, orthodox, and so forth are also fetishizing, and not because I think it's pluralistic or anything. It's just that under 2 centuries of this kind of activity, or 150 plus years of this, there are problems with reductivist, orthodox, and dogmatic elements that have tendencies. They're just there, and they become problematic in the big picture. Although there have been sometimes elements of this sort operative in particular movements, many of which have been correctly criticized and practically overcome by anti-imperialist Marxists, the expansive international history of DHM has been one characterized by the significant innovations, impressive levels of creativity, highly refined and dialectical analyses, extremely perceptive strategic and tactical calculations, savvy practical solutions, and in general, a successful charting of uncharted territory. All that's good. That's all good. But, once you start sort of going, well, you're not, you're being anti-imperialist, you're not being anti-imperialist enough, is going to be always the problem of this kind of discourse. So this does not mean that there have not been major mistakes and setbacks, et cetera, as well as conflicts and disagreements. Sure, certainly. The path to developing socialism in the real world has been torturous and complicated, to say the least. However, this is the price one has to pay if you're not operating in the purportedly pristine world of pure ideas. When you're not developing socialism in the real world, you're tasked with creating something that has never existed before, and you have to do it under conditions of constant imperialist aggression. That's for sure. There has never been a single instance where socialism has been allowed to develop on its own. Now, that's important as well. We've only known socialism under siege, as Michael Parenti emphasized, never socialism set free. This has meant that socialists have always had to be extremely innovative and open to an ongoing process of practical readjustment, as well as, when necessary, honest and humble self-critique. This is why, once you think about what counts as, Maoism in its more pure form, why that's all necessary. Let us cite a few examples and blah, blah, blah. It is the standard core of the history. Lenin, not only because he led the first successful socialist revolution, but also because he situated the anti-imperialist struggle at the very heart of socialist state-building projects by recognizing that the class struggle in an imperialist world primarily takes the form of national liberation, or a national struggle of liberation from imperialism. And unless you think that's unimportant, even the current situation of, imperialist silliness that goes on in Davos, you sort of have to, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're just up there and protest, throw stuff, fight with the police, you actually get people to sort of adjust to this problem and make your critique, in some cases from within. And that's doesn't always happen, or doesn't really happen in the terms of Davos. Although, some of us, there, I'm on the WEF mailing list, but it doesn't really help me, necessarily, although it gives you a sense of where they're coming from. But anyway, drawing on Lenin, Mao Zedong adapted this lesson and others to the specificities of underdeveloped agrarian China with its large peasant population. This is the same thing, it was adopted because of Lenin, right? I mean, this is the model. Ho Chi Minh incorporated Lenin's insights into the liberation struggle in Vietnam, which was woefully underdeveloped by colonialism. Thank you for the French, and then became a major target of imperialist warfare for decades, bringing a whole series of additional problems that needed to be dealt with through a protracted People's War. Now, People's War even itself is a problematic construction, but anyway. And if you look at the history of Ho Chi Minh, he's not as doggedly, anti-imperialist at one point or several points. Particularly, he's in Paris, he goes, he spends time in Moscow, blah, blah, blah. All that parts of the history are needed to be sort of adjusted in that particular way when we think of Ho Chi Minh and the history of Vietnam. Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara drew on these lessons and others to engage in guerrilla warfare, organize the peasantry, bring socialism to the Western Hemisphere on an island just 90 miles from the U.S. empire. And, this goes on further. Cuba has its own issues, and you can see it currently with the Venezuela stuff. It's on Marco Rubio's radar or his remit to try to overthrow the government in Cuba. And I don't think it's going to do it, but it's sort of amusing to see him try. On the other hand, he's wasting an incredible amount of American resources. He will be wasting a large amount of American resources to try and do that, because it hasn't happened yet. And in fact, it's been tried by X number of administrations for, 60 years. And, the Americans have done a shitty job of it, whatever. Anyway, in a theoretical vacuum, but to solve practical problems in Chinese territory, which is what he said before, a real task of DHM to construct a new world out of the ruins of the old. And this is the fundamental issue. This is the vanguard question. The practical orientation of DHM has led to a refined understanding of the relationship between tactics and strategy, what we refer to as the dialectics of socialism. Now, recall that, of course, we never, you haven't seen the real socialism yet. So how is it that you can have how do you get to, a refined understanding of the dialectics if you've never been able to get it enacted? Lenin provided one of the most succinct and insightful metaphors for understanding it. He's described, and this is the fundamental element, which I would assume, and which I think the Keene article represents, and which is why I brought up a whole bunch of things about accounting, financial accounting, because it is the differences among financial accounting that allow us to refine our critique of and to understand. The things that Michael Hudson is talking about relative to the 2007-8, the Great Recession. So the Lenin example metaphor here is quite useful. Unfortunately, it gets us off into the weeds relative to accounting. But you need to sort of think about why is it that you need to think about that, and you don't need to have to do scads of double entry bookkeeping in order to do it. He described a scene in which a mountain climber seeking to access a summit that had never been before attained was forced to turn back, descend, seek another path, longer perhaps, but one that would enable him to reach the summit. Now, the point, of course, here is having to come back to where you started. And that's, of course, for some people, you sort of give up and not do any of this. But, this is that important element of task commitment. At a safe distance, people below watched his movements through a telescope and maligned him for failing to attain his goal. Some gleefully celebrated his lack of success and denounced him as a lunatic, hoping he would fall, whereas others concealed their joy and feigned sorrow over the fact that the poor soul had not awaited the completion of their well-thought-out plan for scaling the mountain. They all agreed, however, that what they saw before their eyes was a clear case of failure. Now, let me just break here for a moment and say, in my other work or whatever, someone pointed out from um, a collective problem solving idea. This was when I had to go do a visit at a Italian business school, and it's business. It's not Marxist. They did a ropes exercise, which reminded me that, yes, this is exactly the problem of trying a balance between planning, organizing, and execution, and looking at kind of the structural questions of how to achieve that. And frankly, you can see that in basic, for example, ropes exercises. The onlookers in this metaphor rely on sense perception to arrive at their conclusion. Now, this is that problem that the reason why you get Western Marxism is their resistance to a Lenin-style sense perception argument. But anyway, to arrive at their conclusion, what they saw was a mountain climber turning back from the summit and descending. What they lacked was understanding. Since the climber could not advance on the chosen path, the only possible way of making to the summit was to descend and find another way forward. Now, note that this text was written 11 months after the promulgation of the new economic policy, the NEP, in March 1921, which temporarily introduced a free market and capitalism, both subject to state control. Now, it becomes clear in the final paragraph of Lenin's article, the climber he described was a metaphorical representation of the Soviets who had enacted the NEP, which Lenin described as our retreat, our descent. The leader of the Russian Revolution thereby provided us with a metaphorical depiction of the dialectics of socialism. What appears to sense perception as a step backward is, at the level of the understanding, simply a necessary maneuver in order to successfully advance towards the overall objective. And you see this replicated, and I'll do something related to that. Mao talks exactly about the same thing, in slightly different ways. Taking Tiger Mountain by strategy or whatever. There are prosaic ways in which Mao approached the problem. But, it is a philosophical question in that sense perception is the lowest level of socialist consciousness. Simply looks to consist in looking at the world, comparing it to a picture in one's mind. This is very Leninist, without necessarily understanding the nature of the world or the struggles at hand. This reductive approach is characteristics of imperial and imperious Marxists. So this is, this Lenin example has a lot of other side elements to it, and, it's worth arguing about. And this returns to the issue of whether you have preconceived or other kinds of strategic approaches to achieving socialism. And I think the answer, as Rockhill sort of talks about, is to be found at a higher level of socialist consciousness than sense perception. At this level, it becomes clear that the material nature of the world is such that certain tactics which appear to amateur eyes to be forms of retreat are actually necessary steps backward in order to make, yes, as it were, leaps forward. So the faster socialist countries can establish their sovereignty and develop their productive forces, the quicker they are going to be able to, if they stay on the socialist path, move to the next level and work through these contradictions, because they're no longer simply struggling for survival. This does not mean that one simply has to accept any and all tactics that wave the flag of socialism. It's important in this regard that social struggle continues under socialism, and that socialist projects have engaged in different tactics for dealing with imperialism and responding to the need to develop. We can and should critically assess the relative success or failures of specific tactics, which is part of the ongoing collective process of practical learning. So anyway, I'm going to stop here, mainly because, I'm just rehearsing what I did in a prior tape. And, it's a kind of conclusion, or this is the front end to the Rockhill text. I mean, he does a lot of other stuff. But it is important, if one conclusion can be drawn from this book, it is that in relationship to the commodified forms of Marxism promoted by the imperial superstructure, we have nothing but our intellectual chains to lose, and we have a world to win. I think it is a straw argument, but I would assert, yes, that there are plenty of commodified forms of Marxism, just as there are plenty of commodified forms of capitalism or whatever. And so the issue is, yes, we can identify the imperial superstructure, but I think that it's our analysis that has to be refined to understand the underlying questions of, well, why is it that we use the concept of commodified? Why is it that commodity implies, with all due respect in terms of the current mode of production, money? And so it actually becomes much more serious than that. And commodified forms of Marxism, is treated in this particular context by Rockhill, with all due respect, as a kind of indulgence as opposed to a necessity. And so I find that, kind of where we should head. Anyway, so I'm going to stop here. Are there any questions or comments or brickbats or whatever? Of course not. Let me shut off the live stream because we have other matters to get to later this evening. Spirituality, etc., is going to be on in a while.